The demographic landscape is changing in the United States, and new data from the 2020 census shows that Alaska is no different. Our population is growing and is more diverse than ever. What regions of the state are growing the fastest? And what do the numbers tell us about shifting racial and ethnic trends? We're discussing census results and what they mean right now on Alaska Insight. The results of the 2020 census were initially delayed because of the COVID-19 pandemic. When they were finally released last month, the numbers painted a vivid picture of shifting demographics in the United States and Alaska. Alaska Public Media's Adeline Baxter has our data breakdown.
First, here are the major headlines. From 2010 to 2020, Alaska's population increased by about 20,000 to more than 733,000 people. That makes Alaska the 48th most populated state, moving down one spot in the national ranking, ahead of only Vermont and Wyoming now. This represents a 3.3% growth rate over the last decade. That's less than half the average growth rate of 7.4% across the nation overall. We may rank near the bottom in overall population, but we continue to move up the rankings when it comes to diversity. Alaska is now the 12th most racially and ethnically diverse state in the nation. That's determined by the likelihood that any two people selected at random will be from different races. Within the state, the Aleutians East Borough and the Aleutians West Census Area are the most diverse regions. The share of Alaska's population that identifies as Alaska Native and American Indian grew to nearly 22%. Like in much of the rest of the country, the share of the population that identifies as Hispanic also grew in Alaska. It rose to 6.8% in 2020 from 5.5% in 2010. The proportion that identifies as Asian alone increased to 5.9%. The Black population fell to 2.8%, and the Native Hawaiian and other Pacific Islander population rose slightly to 1.7%. The share of Alaska's population that identifies as two or more races also increased, while Alaska's white population declined by more than 10%. In terms of geographic distribution, the Matanuska-Susitna Borough saw significant growth, a more than 18,000 person increase from 2010. The borough is by far the fastest growing in the state. Parts of rural Alaska also grew, including the North Slope Borough, which grew by nearly 15%, and the Kuselvak census area, which gained 12%. Meanwhile, Alaska's largest city, Anchorage, lost 579 residents. The interior's population also decreased, and Southeast saw a slight boost. So, Lori, overall, Alaska's population continues to grow and diversify, but certain areas of the state are seeing more growth than others.
Thanks for that great breakdown, Adeline. There's a lot to unpack in the census information, and here to help us understand what the numbers mean for Alaska is David Howell. David is the head demographer for the state of Alaska. Also joining us is Veri DeSuvio. Did I get that right? I hope I did. Veri is the executive director of the Alaska Public Interest Research Group, or AgPIRG. Hello, David and Veri. Thanks for joining me. And Veri, please, how bad did I destroy your name there?
I am so happy to be here. Thank you. And you did the French pronunciation. The Italian pronunciation is DeSuvero.
DeSuvero. I will remember. I will endeavor to remember that. All right, thank you. David, before we dive into more of the findings, we know that the pandemic greatly complicated the efforts to get the count done. So overall, how thorough do you think it ultimately was?
I think it was very thorough. The Census Bureau does a post-enumeration survey that will give us a little bit more insight into how it went. But overall, it seems like the operations went off not as planned, because obviously you can't plan for a pandemic, but the follow-up operations seem to have been carried out fully.
All right. Alaska often bucks trends that are unfolding in other parts of the nation, and some of the census information for our state seems to support that. For example, Adeline's reporting that we just heard notes that Alaska's population grew at a much slower rate, less than half of the national trend. What was the growth rate in the last census, and do you have any information about why we're growing more slowly?
Well, it's tough to say. Between 2000 and 2010, we actually grew by about 80,000 people, or a growth rate of 13%. So quite a bit faster than this decade. A major factor for us is the economy down south was doing poorly early on in this decade, and we saw a lot of net positive migration early in the decade. But then once the economy kind of fired back up down south, we started to have negative net migration. So we think the state topped out probably around 740,000 in the mid-decade, around 2016, but then net migration turned negative and we actually started losing population. And this has happened previously in the past, that when the lower 48's economy is booming and ours is struggling a little bit, we see negative net migration.
Yes, and kind of following up there, we have heard that we're losing residents. We've had more outflow than in. That doesn't square with the census findings. So help us understand the difference in annual estimates versus the census count that happens every 10 years.
Right. So the census occurs every 10 years, obviously, but then in between, we create population estimates based on a series of data sources. But in Alaska, our primary data source is the permanent fund dividend applications. And so we are very lucky compared to other states that we have this timely source of data in the PFD. We also have births and deaths records coming from our Vital Stats department, as well as IRS records to kind of compare with the PFD applications to check on migration. But the census allows us to kind of reset and compare our methods, or reevaluate our methods, and just see what we were doing well and see what we can improve on.
All right, thank you, David. I want to turn to you, Very, now. Very, what information do you use at AgPIRG, Alaska Public Interest Research Group, from the census, and how is it used? Today, the Census Bureau released information related to housing demographics. Is that an area that you'll dig in on? And please kind of let us know what is useful information from AgPIRG's perspective.
Yeah, thank you so much, Lori. I think that we did a lot of work actually to make sure that the census was answered. And so from a public interest and consumer advocacy standpoint, which is really what AgPIRG does, is looking at both how can we make sure that everyone's participating in the census to be counted, to have the best numbers possible. And then also once the census has been answered and we do have more of that information, it affects everything. So housing numbers are absolutely something that we're going to be digging into, looking at how housing trends, how the, obviously the pandemic has affected, the housing market around the state, is interacting with those numbers. And in addition to that, there's a lot of lending patterns, a lot of, financial issues around consumers that we're going to be looking into as well. And then especially, looking at access issues. So language access is a big piece of our work. We actually helped translate the census into Alaska Native languages for the first time ever, and also provided other world languages or other information in world languages for the census. And so, not only looking at the fact that we knew those languages would be needed, but also now looking to see where in other parts of life, in economic growth, and in other, pieces of our society, where that language access is also going to be needed.
And when you're looking at things like housing demographics and lending patterns, are you specifically looking for discriminatory practices, or what is it that you're seeking to better understand? And then how will you use that information to work with lawmakers, or maybe if there's a policy issue that needs to be addressed?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. I think the great thing about data is that it can really tell a story, and also it provides you with a really good starting place. So for one example, we do a lot of work around payday lending. And payday lending is a specific type of loan that you can get for a short time, and the interest rates can be pretty high. So in Alaska, a 14-day loan for $100 is 521% interest rate, which is really high. And so one of the things that we do is we look across, what geographies are mostly taking out these loans versus other loans that may have a lower interest rate. And also, are there any sort of racial discrimination patterns or patterns where veterans are taking out these loans at higher rates than civilians, which it turns out communities of color, low-income communities, and veterans tend to get payday loans at higher rates. So the census helps inform all of that work that we do, which then helps provide a good, sound basis when we are talking to policymakers.
Really important and good to know. Thank you so much. David, let's turn back to you now. I want you to walk us through what you found most interesting about Alaska's census data. But first, this year the census form allowed for up to 6 different ethnic categories to be checked, whereas in the past only 2 were allowed. How does this affect the results, and also how do you think it affects participation? Do you know if more people engaged because of these larger selection options?
Yeah, they definitely changed the race and ethnicity questions this year, and this was the first year that the white and black race were able to write in responses, and it seems like they definitely did write in responses. This has led to the decline in the white alone population, as well as the black alone population. In the past, other races were allowed to write things in, but not the white and black population, which is good. It allows people to kind of identify themselves more how they see themselves. But as far as people certainly marked more races, and that could be a shifting demographic in Alaska, in that we have baby boomers are moving out, and older people tend to just select one race, and then we have younger people coming in, and so younger people tend to see themselves more diversely than the older cohorts.
Do you think that this increase in categories, what do you think about it? Do you think it could expand again, or at some point do the percentages just become too small to be meaningful?
That's a great question. They seem to change them every couple of decades, so I could definitely see them expanding. I don't know. They've talked about using Hispanic as a race in the past, but it seems to have kind of moved away from that, and just kind of diversifying that Hispanic ethnicity question to allow for more options. But it's interesting on our end because it makes some of the data less comparable. So comparing race alone between 2010 and 2020, it's a little different because the question has changed so much. So for data consistency, can be a little frustrating, but I could definitely see them expanding it even farther.
All right. Your thoughts here. Do you think there should be more options? What are your thoughts about this ability to select more ethnicities, and what would you like to see going forward as far as choice?
Yeah, it's a great question. And, there is that balance of making sure that there's useful aggregate data, and then the data for people to actually feel represented in who they are. And I know as we were working on the census, we got a lot of those questions, trying to help people understand, what to answer on their form. And so one of the huge categories that I know there's a lot of advocacy around, and a push to expand to, is Middle Eastern. Right now, Middle Eastern communities and individuals are counted as white, which a lot of groups and people believe doesn't represent, their identities and also their position and power and representation in our society. And so, I think that's just one example of where hopefully the Census Bureau will be working with, communities to figure out what options really do represent who they are and how they see themselves.
Does it feel sort of like the census is still kind of catching up to how rapidly we're becoming much more diverse, and different people are marrying into different ethnicities at a rate that is the census just kind of not catching up as well as it should at this point?
Well, it's hard. I mean, it's hard because everyone's their own person, right? And so the Census Bureau has a long history, and not all of it is a good history. And so, especially when working with Alaska Native communities, there's a lot of um, trust repairing that needs to happen. And we saw a lot of that in this past census. There were some Census Bureau workers who really wanted to make sure that folks knew, um, how to put their tribe instead of their Alaska Native Corporation on the census form. But there's still a long way to go for sure, as we're making sure that people feel represented in this country. That's a tall order, and it's hard to do that in 10 questions.
This question might sort of be self-evident just based on what we've been talking about, but people who identified as white only fell more than 10 percentage points. Very, did you find that surprising at all? And then David, we'll turn back to you.
I mean, it's hard to say. I'm not the demographer, but I think I was really not surprised, but glad to see that there was a rise in Alaska Native population, since Alaska has always been an indigenous place, and with the rise of people identifying as mixed race and feeling confident also putting on their forms that they could put more than one race and still be counted in both of those races as well as mixed race. I think that the expansion of those categories was really exciting. And just to specify what I mean by that, we heard from a lot of people who, especially Alaska Native folks, who were maybe Alaska Native and then another race, who didn't want to make it seem like there were fewer Alaska Native people in their community by putting mixed race or other. And so, working with the Census Bureau to ensure that if I checked white and then also checked another race, that I wouldn't be discounting myself from both categories by putting both. I think that was really huge. So I guess I don't have a good answer about the white percentage, but I think that it does speak to more trust in sharing more of identities overall.
Yeah, David, pick that up there. Your thoughts about this percentage point drop, and does that just seem like it makes sense because people are more comfortable with adding in other ethnicities now?
I was actually quite surprised. I think I triple checked the numbers when I realized the decline in the white alone population. People have been able to select multiple races going back to 2000, but with this write-in category, as very pointed out, people can really identify themselves how they see themselves, which is great. And so it's, it gives us a better picture of what our society actually looks like. So I think it's a good thing, and but I was quite surprised by it.
Well, that's really interesting. Let's continue on that. We know that ethnic diversity, as we've been talking about, has increased overall. Kind of break that down for us. Where were some of the bigger gains?
So the Alaska Native population in particular gained, as you pointed out, going from 19 to 22% of the overall population. And this is not too surprising for us because they see a lot of growth through what we call natural increase, where just births outnumber deaths. And so they have a higher birth rate than Alaska as a whole, and relatively low net migration rates, probably lose about 0.5% a year to net migration. So we weren't too surprised to see their steady growth, bump up their percentage of the actual population. Whereas the baby boomer population who moved here in mass in the late or mid 80s, early 90s, they've kind of reached these retirement ages where Alaska has always seen losses in population. And so we're really starting to see them leave the state. And so that will, kind of lead to a decline in the white population.
Mm-hmm. Following up on, as we were discussing people that identified as Alaska Native only, that percentage dropped, but certainly it grew in combination with other ethnicities. Does this finding square with other ethnic groups as far as increases overall, or maybe including other categories?
Yeah, I mean, Alaska has a growing, Native Hawaiian Pacific Islander community, large Asian communities. So we're seeing growth in these groups, and it's not too surprising. It's kind of stayed on the same course for the last couple of decades. So not too unexpected there.
Is this mirrored in national trends as well?
Yeah, well, I'd have to, I don't have the numbers right in front of me, so I can't say exactly. But I mean, yeah, the nation as a whole did become much more diverse and will continue to do so as people continue migrating in. The US as a whole, the birth rates are down quite a bit. So we will be growing more through migration rather than births in the future. So that will continue to diversify the country as a whole.
The Matanuska-Susitna Borough region saw the biggest population increase, but the interior lost more than 3,000 residents. What regions of interior and of the state saw the biggest losses?
Fairbanks saw the biggest loss, and Fairbanks's number it's a little bit to unpack there because there seemed like there was a slight undercount at the dorms for UAF, so that would account for around 800 people we think, and then another thing to factor in is there's a squadron of F-35s that recently moved to Eielson, but their movement of the troops got delayed because of COVID, so they weren't actually counted there for the census. They would have been counted at their previous duty location. And so now that these airmen are coming in and they're bringing their families, we think we'll see a bump in the Fairbanks population over the next year or two.
What parts of rural Alaska saw increases?
So most of northern and western Alaska saw increases, and this is similar to the Alaska Native population as a whole. Not too much migration, high birth rates, so you get a lot of growth through natural increase, which again is just births outnumbering deaths. And this has just been a steady, just kind of slow growth over the decades. So not too surprising, but the growth definitely jumps out compared to the rest of the state because Anchorage and Juneau and Fairbanks are somewhat driven by out-of-state people moving into the state, which we've kind of seen a lack of in the last few years.
Anchorage lost some residents, under 600. That doesn't really seem like a big number for either gain or loss, but what do you make of that, and is it dramatically different from the 2010 census?
It's not a big loss, but it is surprising because Anchorage has grown consistently in the past. And so that part of it to us was quite surprising. Well, it wasn't too surprising because our estimates, we thought that they were down. And so it kind of backed up what we had estimated. But it was definitely surprising, through the decade that they would actually lose population rather than growing.
You mentioned some surprises. Were there any other big surprises for you in this data that stood out?
Yeah, we were surprised to see Haines was down. We're not clear. We're looking forward. There's a more detailed release of data coming with more age breakouts. Haines is a much older borough, and so we weren't sure if maybe, people snowbird outside of the state, maybe COVID, they didn't come back to Haines in time to be counted in the census, and maybe they're counted in Arizona or something. But we won't know that. We know that a lot of the loss was in the 18 and above population, but we don't know exactly what ages they are. When we get the more detailed release, if it's a lot of people like over the age of 60, then the snowbird theory might actually hold water. But for now, we were surprised to see that it did drop.
Very, how about for you? When you look through the data, were there surprises that stood out to you that were of note?
Yeah, I mean, I think one thing that we did look at the Department of Labor estimates before the census was completed, and the North and Northwest Arctic boroughs gained population, I think, about 1,000 people ish, and I think that was a surprise, which we just hadn't expected. But I think that again, beyond just the numbers, I think the racial diversity piece was not unexpected since we work with a lot of partners, especially the Alaska Literacy Project and RAISE that works on welcoming immigrants and refugees into Alaska. So there is sort of a good sense of what languages and communities are immigrating to Alaska, but seeing that reflected in the data was definitely exciting to see.
All right, well, thank you so much. There's so much to unpack and understand about all the census information. We could keep talking for a long time, but we're out of time. So Barry and David, thank you so much for being with me this evening to help us begin to understand what's coming out with this interesting census information. As you heard this evening, the census is important not only as a reflection of who we are ethnically as Americans and Alaskans, but it's also an important data set that helps the government know where and how much to invest in roads and other infrastructure. And in Alaska, although we continue to be on the lower end of the list for overall population, we also continue to shine as one of the top-tier states for incredible diversity that brings together a rich blend of cultures and traditions to celebrate and enhance all of our collective lives. That's it for this edition of Alaska Insight. Be sure to tune in daily to your local public radio station for Alaska Morning News and Alaska News Nightly every weeknight. Be part of important conversations happening on Talk of Alaska every Tuesday morning, and visit our website, alaskapublic.org, for breaking news and reports from across the state. While you're there, sign up for our free daily digest so you won't miss any of Alaska's top stories of the day. We'll be back next Friday. Thanks for joining us this evening. I'm Lori Townsend. Good night.